Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of Generation Analog. This is panel 5, Industry and Ideology. We're going to be going through the program in program order. And just as a reminder, this panel is being recorded so that we can post it to our YouTube channel. We are in the moderated format. So as the presenters are presenting, feel free to log any questions that you might have in the Q&A. We're going to let all 4 presenters do their thing, and then we will have the Q&A at the end of the session. So without further ado, we're going to be starting today with Jan Švelch, and the paper that he's going to be presenting is called Industrial Reflexivity and Cultural Economics of Game Awards and Prizes. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this morning. And Jan, whenever you're ready, you can take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I hope you can hear me. My name is Jan. I'm a member of Prague Game Production Studies Research Group, and I will be talking about Game Awards and Prizes. So just to start off, I want to introduce the concepts and theoretical perspectives that I will be using in the talk. So, and also I just remember that if you want to follow along on your own computers, I posted the slides in the Discord channel, so you can check it out there and browse at your own leisure. So back to the theoretical perspectives. I'm using the concept of industrial reflexivity, which was developed by John Caldwell in his book Production Culture, and it refers to the ways how industry practitioners represent production cultures and production processes. And this can be both within the culture industry, but also to the outside world. It's perhaps the more visible, those are the more visible forms, like behind the scenes narratives, making of features, and so on, and credits. And I would argue also awards, as they require sort of a buy-in from industry practitioners. And I will be combining this concept with the tradition of cultural economics that looks at cultural kind of effects and phenomena in cultural fields. And there's been some research already done on cultural awards and prizes. And I will just kind of briefly go over the empirical findings. So perhaps the most obvious and expected effect of awards is that they provide revenue boost for winners and nominees. And this has been observed across different fields like board games, including Spiel des Jahres, most prominently, but also books, film, and theater. Maybe more counterintuitively, awards can also have negative effects, such as the observed negative impact on audience evaluation that was seen in some book prizes. And this means, what this kind of translates to is that awards raise the expectations, also bring new audiences to the culture artifact, and this can result in lower user review scores on sites like Goodreads. And there's also has been this interesting effect for losing nominations, so nominations that haven't been transformed into wins, and that they can also have a negative impact. And this has been observed on Broadway performances. So awards have these different kind of economic effects doing with revenue and kind of longevity of these culture artifacts. But it's also important to look at sort of the cultural impact of awards and how they become these reference lists, authoritative lists of what's kind of noteworthy and what can be considered as canon. And Jesper, in this kind of context, has talked about Indie Independent Games Festival and how it has sort of established or helped shape the understanding of how an indie game should look like, especially in the 2000s, later 2000s and 2010s. So kind of really establishing the aesthetic of an indie game by selecting games that kind of look very similar or have similar kind of visual style. And awards also sometimes serve as very convenient samples for researchers, because sometimes it's just easier to justify our selection of games in the peer review process when we can kind of point out that someone already made the list before us. But this also means that it's maybe even more important to kind of reflect on the selection process. Who are the people selecting those awards, and going out of what relationship they have to the industry and other kind of stakeholders in those cultural fields. So for this talk, I will be focusing on five examples, five case studies. So this is kind of following a case study methodology, and I will be also making some comparisons with video game awards. And earlier this year, I gave a talk at DIGRA, or a presentation about the game awards. So I will be making a couple of comparisons between analog game awards and video game awards. And I'm kind of drawing mostly on preliminary thematic analysis of official websites and press coverage. So sort of a work in progress that I'm sharing here today. And for the sample, I've tried to select also like newer prizes, like the American Tabletop Awards, prizes that are more focused, like the Ennies, popular vote prizes like the Golden Geek, but also more established prizes with longer history, like Origins Award or Spiel des Jahres. So to kind of just give you a brief kind of comparison to video game awards, and this is a classification of my own, so it's not sort of, what I'm trying to kind of show here, that there's a very important kind of relationship between the industry, especially for the major awards like the Game Awards, British Academy Games Awards, or DICE annual awards. And they are very kind of have close connection to the video game industry, especially the mainstream game industry. There are also other awards focusing more on the indie sector and popular vote as well. So the most kind of visible one from the video game awards, from the video game space, is the Game Awards show hosted by Jeff Keighley, which is a huge media event with millions of viewers. And what's interesting about it is that it's not just an award ceremony, but it's an important promotional event for video game publishers. So there's this very direct connection to it, and it also kind of shapes the kind of political economy of the show. It is really requires the participation of the companies, and there's this sort of synergy between the show and the kind of the awards part of the show and the promotional aspect. And there are also sales and various kind of commodification aspects going on related to the event. So it's sort of the event is the important part of the Game Awards. If we look at analog Game Awards, and I'm kind of going talking about the 5 examples that I've chosen for this talk, although there are many more that I didn't have time to look into yet. A lot of them seem to rely on volunteer labor on various levels of organization, especially from the jurors that are selecting the awarded games. This is perhaps kind of notable if we kind of keep in mind that there has been an acknowledged economic impact of these prizes, that they really can drive sales of awarded games. And this has been talked about a lot in the context of Spiel des Jahres. And what this also means is that once there has been this understanding that prizes and awards can help in selling games, a logo licensing of these awards like Spiel des Jahres and American Tabletop Awards can be used as a revenue source for these organizations that are running the awards. It's hard to say how much does it kind of cover from the organizational cost, but still it's sort of a way to recoup some costs. And also sort of one important difference from the Game Awards that I've already kind of talked about briefly is that this award ceremonies for analog Game Awards seem to be smaller, although there are also sometimes physical events at conventions like the Gen Con or the Origins Game Fair. But compared to the Game Awards, where the media event is the major part of the award, for analog Game Awards, the lists with the nominated and winning games seem to be kind of the more important part of the process of selecting and awarding games. And there are a lot of differences even among the small sample that I've selected for this talk, ranging from selection process using juries or popular vote or some kind of combination of both. There are also different types of people involved in those juries, with Origins and American Tabletop Awards kind of being very closely aligned with the industry, Origins requiring industry experience, and American Tabletop Awards being the jury consisting of industry experts, influencers, and content creators who work very closely with the industry promoting their games. So the connection is kind of closer than maybe if we look at other awards that are maybe more in the space of culture intermediaries and maybe more closely related to the specialized press, like the Spiel des Jahres. There are also many different award categories given out by these prizes. And unfortunately, I don't really have time to go much deeper into it, but this could be another conversation about what kind of, how these categories are define what it kind of says about the target audience and the function of these awards. And I've also conducted a small quantitative analysis, kind of just looking at the last 5 editions, also due to the fact that American Tabletop Awards was established only in 2019, looking at these categories from these prizes. And I've excluded Ennies because they have a very different focus. Tabletop role-playing games and Origins Awards was fairly inconsistent recently and also has been criticized for kind of representing the old guard of the board gaming hobby. So, as was also Aaron Tremel talks about in his book, The Privilege of Play. And I've also will be showing some comparisons with the data from Board Game Geek as sort of the leading international resource for board gamers and how kind of the awarded games do on the forum. So there seems to be this consensus that some games are sort of very deserving of prizes, at least if we look at the 3 prizes that I'm looking more closely at here, with games like Cascadia, The Crew, and Wingspan winning all 3 prizes. This, I guess, already kind of shows us which kind of games are celebrated and kind of praised by these juries and by these organizations that are selecting these games. If we look at country and publisher data, we can see sort of a clear bias toward Western countries, also, of course, influenced by the selection of these prizes, with American Tabletop Award being focused on the US market and Spiel des Jahres focused on the German market. But it's still interesting to see that games from other regions are not represented more, or these are the top 3 countries, and 11 countries were represented in the whole sample. But what's also, I guess, notable is that there's no one publisher that would be dominating this space of the awards. Only 3 publishers had more than 1 winning game, with 2 each listed here on the slide. And looking at the stats on Board Game Geek, and I think it's fairly well known that Board Game Geek sort of is focused more or prioritizes higher complexity, heavier weight games that kind of occupy the top spots of this of the ranking at the site. And here we can kind of see that some of the games that are awarded are doing well on the site, but especially the ones that are from these related to the categories aimed at children are fairly low rated on the site. And this is just kind of to say that there's not a perfect overlap, or not that there shouldn't be, between kind of these awards and Board Game Geek, but there's seems like there for some of these awards the audience looks to be different than the audience of those awards. So to get to my preliminary conclusions, what I want to highlight is that there are various degrees of industry involvement and reflexivity, with Golden Geek kind of being the most separate, being a popular vote, although of course users on Board Game Geek can also be game designers, and I guess they can also participate in voting, and American Tabletop Awards and Origins Awards being more aligned with the industry. And I think that also warrants the use of the concept of industry reflexivity, as these awards are also meant to kind of celebrate the industry and kind of showcase the best kind of games, and that helps to sort of prop the whole industry, kind of showing the good examples. And this is something that the industry itself is, of course, interested in, kind of showing the good examples, the good products, of course. There still also seems to be a Western or national bias, which is, of course, partially caused by the selection of these case examples that I have been talking about in this paper. But it's still interesting to see that games from Eastern Europe are maybe not as frequently featured here, but of course this is also caused by the me looking at only at the last 5 years. So we might see this changing. And I also want to kind of end up on the note that it's interesting to see that these awards seem to often require volunteer labor, despite the fact that it has been widely acknowledged that they create monetary value for analog game publishers. So it's interesting to see how how this dynamic between who are kind of the tastemakers or are participating in this kind of culture intermediary work, but who's kind of reaping the benefits. And I think that's also something that is worth talking about more, especially if we kind of then look at the different juries and how they kind of, from which position they kind of participate in this taste-making process and gatekeeping process. So that's it for me. Thank you for your attention.
All right. Thank you so much for kicking us off so strongly. And then that was the alarm. So you're perfectly on time too. That was great. So our next speaker is Mikhail Sousa, and the paper that he will be presenting is called Forcing Consciousness, Spatial Planning, Serious Games, and Design Techniques from Real Case Studies.
So hello, I'm going to share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay.
You're good to go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm a researcher who uses games as tools. Besides the game design research that I do, most of the times I use games to support urban and participatory and collaborative planning approaches. So today here I'm going to speak about some cases that I've been finding and then been experienced during the last years. So something that usually I say in the start of these processes, projects, or sessions is that we should be careful because games could be manipulations. And yes and no, they can be a sort of manipulation, but we can avoid this by doing some game design options or some procedural options that I will be talking about. So the freedom to play or not should never force people to play the game. It's something that we should say when we invite participants. For example, imagine that we are dealing with an urban master plan and we want the stakeholders to say what they want, to discuss and to find solutions. They have the freedom or not to participate in this type of approaches. And having decision making in these games usually tends to player agency, to stakeholder agency, which is something to avoid manipulation, but also is related to manipulation because they are always playing according to a framework or according to some specific rules that the game designer, the series game designer, have implemented in the game. And we should frame this decision making, making it clear and transparent. So saying that this was our framework, we departed from this model, and this is not the total reality, it's not reality, it's not total true. This is some assumptions that we created in the model. And we should make it clear and transparent what were the consequences of some decisions for the participants be informed and be consciousness about what they are entering and what the game will provide. And this can be done with a tutorial and some user experience and user interface created specifically for this. And of course, with the proper game facilitation. This is something I do myself when I create these games, and the team that work with me, we train this and we create what we think is the best facilitation as possible. So, and we also need to manage complexity, because in this case, when we use games as a tool, sometimes we are playing with non-gamers and people that are not used to play this game. So even the simplest games that we think can be simple, it can be very complicated and complex for the participants. So we need to be careful. And of course, doing a debriefing, because the games are emergent system that creates sometimes something that isn't predictable. We should address what were the experience for the players. Sometimes each person perceives it as a different thing that was not as we expected as designers. So we should do this debriefing after the sessions. I would say, and I will argue, that if we do not do the debriefing in an applied game or a serious game, we don't have a serious product. So I think this is mandatory. So games as tools. There's the ethical challenge here, because a game is a tool for a specific public when we create it. So we'll force them to play the game. And if we force them to play, are we really having the game? Because the game should be voluntary. So this is something to think about. And if it's not voluntary, it's really a game. So when we use games in schools, games in projects, we sometimes force people to play these games. So we should be conscious about this. And games about sustainability. So I'm going to talk a lot about a real case study. The participants that played this game were not forced to play it, but they were incentivized to play it. And the purpose was to learn about sustainability. And the game was built like an Euro game with the following traits: deterministic without randomness. So no dice, no other type of mechanical system to introduce input or output randomness. It was deterministic, and collaborative in the first stages and semi-cooperative in the final versions of the game. And the mechanisms were in the simplification, set collections, connections, stacking, and the narrative was to create the most efficient, sustainable model to distribute resources evenly for the population. And you can see here the result. This is a simplified version of the game, just created some common components that we can see in many Euro games, and departing from a modulation with hexagons. So the economy, it was created for the game that the economy did not provide enough resources to all the population. So this was intended. And the components, as I talked, were really common. And the spatial modulation with hexagons. And you can see here the white cubes, the big ones, they represent urban density. So the hexagons where you have big cubes, for example, 3 piles stacked, is a zone with high density, where a zone with 1 or none has no occupation or small urban density. So this is a way to represent it. And the colored cubes represented the resources. So the purpose was to deliver one resource of each type. This was to simulate sustainability. So they should have access to all types of goods in an equal balance. And each colored cube represented that the source of the resource is getting to the place where the people live. So, and the sticks are the connections and the infrastructure to connect the cubes from the sources that are these slabs, colored slabs, to the destination. And it was done like this, so we enter here some contradictions, because to reduce the complexity, I could not tell the participants all the difficulties and the complexity of the game. It was a progression. And first I let the players define the spatial grid with total freedom, then locate the resources, total freedom, then locate the urban zones, make the stack session as they wish, and then create the infrastructures to distribute the resources for all urban zones as necessary. And then they see the scoring points, because they scored points if a urban zone had access to all the resources or if it was empty. And then they played again, knowing the purposes, and then trying to create a better result. And now some of the manipulations. So there was not enough resources to all the population. So, and this led players to stack cubes in zones and then decide not to deliver the resources to some of the specific parts. So, and I asked them, why did they do that? And this was to introduce the narrative. And in this case, they talked about inequality that was it was impossible not to do. So they decided that some of the inhabitants of this fictional country will not have access to all the resources because there were not enough resources to everybody, and they deliberately decided that a significant amount of the population would not have access to anything. So this was to introduce their consciousness. So a manipulation in the game system to lead to reflection. And then they play the game again. It was divided into tables, and then I introduced some cards to simulate specific goals that represented the stakeholders' hidden agendas. And they were forced to collaborate because only the team with the highest score will count the individual score. So another way to introduce here a simulation of stakeholders' agendas that usually want something specific that goes against the common good or not. It depends on each case, but it was a way to simulate this. Also a manipulation to enforce this experience. So we can use scarcity to simulate the economic limitations, and we could define that there are not enough resources to everyone to force this thinking about inequality. And using objective cards can be an efficient way to simulate stakeholder hidden agendas. But despite this agency and these deterministic mechanisms of Eurogames, we are forcing a model and we are forcing an experience. So although we are giving them freedom to choose agency, we are manipulating the users. So what I can conclude. We have some solutions for this. I've been using co-design, and this was a case study. It was from the European Union project. And the design process was to first define a goal. The goal was to deliver a collaborative planning process for local stakeholders. And the methodology was to co-design the game with the municipality civil servants and define several stages. The first stage was about using slight games and a collaborative voting system to define the priorities, and then introduce the stakeholders to drawing games because they needed to deal with maps and to geolocated information. And we know that users and the stakeholders that are not used to model with maps have a great difficulty to understand the spatial locations. And the third stage was the co-designing with the municipality civil servants and considering the stakeholders' preferences. And then we created a game that it's just like a participatory budget system, and to collect data to support the planning decision making. So you can see the first ideation, the first step. It was about ice breaking and using party games to frame the problems and make the stakeholders more connected to each other. And we see here the voting system. They are working in proposals. You can see a firefighter participating in this session. And then we see the second session when they are using some drawing games that I adapted specifically for this, where they are managing the plans. And then we started to work with the civil servants from the municipality to train them as facilitators for the process and to create the game that the stakeholders, the several entities that were part of the process worked together and plan a city. And this is the department leaderships of the municipality, and these are the councillors and the mayor playing the game. And because the game had a narrative, the narrative was that the participants were the politicians. So the politicians played as themselves. It was very curious to see this. And then the game was adapted to be played by children, simplified and located around their school. And it also had a possibility to reduce bias because in another session, I let the children define their school. So they created a vision of their school. It was not defined by me as the game designer, it was defined by them. So we can allow the users to create their own approaches by representing what we want to address by their terms. And just to end, this is another session where with a map, with colored strings, we created a participatory planning process where the users could enter and leave the stage as they wanted. So a way to reduce the bias and to reduce the manipulation, because usually when we are dealing with adults, they want to see first. So they could enter and leave the game as they wish. So this is a technique that I recommend to reduce this bias. And this is published in the Simulation in Gaming. You can see how it was done. And a summary, just to end. I don't know if I have more time, but I'm ending now. We most serious games, the design intention will deliver a kind of manipulation, even though we consider player agency. We are always manipulating because we are using a model that is predefined. And what seems to solve the problem? Transparency in playability, facilitation, UI, UX, to make the participants, the players, aware of what's happening in the game, co-design to introduce their perspectives in the design of the game, sandbox games where the game allows the players to do different things as they wish. It's more difficult to analyze the data after this, but it can be done, and the freedom to enter and to leave the game at any time. And however, the game system will always represent the game designer's visions, and the rules and the mechanism enforce it. So it's done. You have my content, my website, where you can see some of the projects, and I'm also a content creator and I create videos. So I will be very glad to enter the discussion with Jan, because I'm also a jury of one of these prizes here in Portugal. So thank you. I hope this was easy to follow. And sorry about my English. And I was not seeing the chat, so I hope that I didn't have more time than I really had. Sorry.
No, you were like right on the button. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our third presenter is Catherine Croft, and she's going to be telling us about industry bias towards complex board game design. So Catherine, take it away.
All right, great. Thank you so much for having me. Can you see this? Let's see.
Yes, we can.
Okay, let me put it on slideshow. Okay, perfect. So today I'm talking about industry bias towards complex board game design. And just a little background about me. I'm actually a neuroscientist, but I transitioned to being a teacher about 8 years ago. So I teach in a public high school, and I'm also a game designer. So I started my own small STEM-themed board game company about 8 years ago called Cat Lily Games. And so it started out of stuff that I would use in the classroom, and then it kind of blossomed from there. So I have 3 different hats that I'm talking from. And my long-term vision that I'm working on is, how do we make modern board games more accessible to families? So that's where I'm coming from with my topic today. And you might ask, like, why? Like, why do we even care? Why should this matter? And I think, so these are reasons that I think are very important for us to address. So one is for societal awareness of certain issues and concerns, such as bias or like climate change, racism, things like that affect our society. We can actually convey these themes and learn from them in board games. Another one is content knowledge. So as a teacher, I know that, well, we all know that like board games are better for abstract critical thinking skills, but you can actually convey knowledge relevant to standardized tests that are important for schools. So unfortunately, I can tell you that at least in Virginia, where I am, standardized tests are still what teachers are held accountable for. And they're all multiple choice, kind of cramming for facts. And so it's hard to get board games in the classroom unless you can show that I can actually teach certain concepts through this. And there are games like that out there on the market that do a wonderful job of letting you convey the content knowledge. Also for social emotional learning, board games are an amazing tool for this. They let children be face-to-face, taking turns, resolving conflicts. Cooperative games can be great in learning collaboration skills. So I'm also a fan of certain digital games in the classroom, but there's nothing like a tabletop game to really bring together like social emotional learning and content knowledge and abstract thinking all into one. And of course, critical thinking skills, because the more you play these like abstract or even not abstract, but the different board game mechanics can really enhance how a child thinks and approaches problems. So these are reasons to reach mass audiences. So this is why we care. And so I started this last year because I'm coming from a perspective of family board games. I think Jan had also touched on the fact that we know that Board Game Geek is skewed towards, as a whole, like newer, more complex games, heavyweight games. And actually, Elizabeth Hargrave has done like quite a few like research talks about this, showing graphs and data behind that. But so last year, I believe it was for this conference actually, I had the top 100 family games from Board Game Geek, and I compared it to Amazon, because Amazon, I took their ratings are based on not just sales, but also reviews. And so there were only 7 that actually overlapped, which was interesting. I did the same thing again for this year with a data freeze of March 22nd. And it was about this date, it was like 6%. So 6 games overlapped. So not a great deal overlap, not too shocking, but still noteworthy. And if you're curious what these games are, so last year in 2022, it was 7 Wonders, Carcassonne, Cascadia, Codenames, Class, Ticket to Ride, and Wingspan. It's some of these carried over to this year in 2023, but not everything. So like now we see Azul on there, and Cascadia is no longer on there, and neither is Class. Ticket to Ride and Wingspan and Carcassonne and Codenames all held up. So like there are trends in popularity of games, like if they're newer games, like Cascadia was newer last year, so maybe that has something to do with it. But these are the kinds of games that appeal. And it's noteworthy that these aren't like super simple games, right? So like Wingspan is arguably a little difficult to learn how to play for the average person, and yet it's hugely popular. So I think one point to take from this is that you can't don't underestimate math audiences. Like they do like good quality games. It's just that we're not reaching them with a lot of these themes and a lot of the complexity that we're facing. So if you're curious, so I took the top 100 family games from Board Game Geek, and I was curious where they lay on the complexity rankings. So Board Game Geek has 1 to 5 complexity ratings. So 1 is light, 3 medium, 5 heavy, and it's on a spectrum. And so you can see here out of these 100, it is sort of centered around 2. So a medium light game. And then there wasn't any that was past the medium complexity, which is not surprising. And what's interesting is that when I did, I looked at just the games that overlap between Board Game Geek and Amazon from this list. So it's a subset of the first graph at the top. It's skewed slightly lighter. It wasn't as big of a jump as I thought there would be, to be honest. So the median of the top 100 was 1.96, and then the median of the overlapping games was 1.81. So it is going more towards the medium light, but it's not like you have to jump, like I said earlier, to this super light game like Candyland. Like they can handle interesting, complex games. And so previously what I decided, just because I was curious, because I design games myself, and most designers do, I look to these ranking systems to see like what's considered a good game. And so I decided to create this own like ranking system where I combined BGG and Amazon and had a new family ranking. So I took the top 100 from BGG, top 100 from Amazon, and then I rank ordered them and had a new combined score and had a new ranking system. So for example, here's a BGG. I took their family game rank and I just rank ordered them like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then the Amazon also, like whatever they had overall, like I had it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I combined the two scores together and then I got a new score. And so what I came up with was, this is last year's. So if you do a combined thing where you can consider older classic games and simpler popular games, this is what I curated last year. So the number one game was Codenames. And what's interesting is now you see games like chess pop up in there, which it's funny that chess is not in the top 100 even overall of Board Game Geek. And I think we can all agree that chess is a masterfully designed game. So it's Board Game Geek is very biased towards these newer complex games, as we know, and like a lot of these classic things like chess or Clue, or things that have held up over time, like really simple mechanics that are just really elegant and clever, don't carry through unless you combine the two of them together. So this is kind of a marriage of hobbyist and mainstream industries. So then something else I noticed when I was starting my research last year is that the age recommendations were surprisingly different between a lot of the games on board, like by the publisher and what's listed by the seller on Amazon. So about 65% of them matched, like, let's say the publisher said, okay, we recommend this game for 8+. And then Amazon's also, okay, yeah, this is for 8+. But a lot of them did not. So Board Game Geek, actually, the publisher recommended a much lower age range than what the public seems to think is appropriate. And then there were some that were ranked for higher ages, but like 27% were ranked lower than Amazon ages, and only 8% were ranked higher. So here's an example from what I'm talking about. So like for Wingspan, the publisher recommends ages 10 and up, but on Amazon, the community agrees it's for 14 and up. And there's other slight ones like Everdell's 13 and 14. Some other ones, let's see here. Sometimes Ticket to Ride is 8, Amazon will say 10. And then Point Salad, interestingly, is ranked 8, and then Amazon is age 14. And I know that some of this has to do with like testing, safety testing for children, but not all of it, because these are cards. And so like card games wouldn't need that same sort of testing, but Sushi Go Party was ranked for 8+ by the publisher, 12+ by the community. So other ones that were ranked the other way, or like Depor, Sagrada, those actually went down in, like, they were ranked for higher ages than what the community thought. So it does go both ways, but it's significantly more skewed to publishers thinking that games are able to be handled by younger audiences than can actually handle them. And so this is what I did for 2023. I was actually pretty happy to see this seemed to be going in the right direction. So the match was now 74%, which is more than the 65% from last year. And the lower ages were now 19%. And then the higher ages were about like the same, 7 to 8%. So I'm hopeful that the industry is now realizing more about what the community can really handle and what they can't. And anecdotally, so I'm a designer and a teacher, and I encounter many kids of all ages. I've also taught like K through 12, all ages, and I've play tested. And when I play test my kids' games with other designers, they're always trying to make it more complex all the time. And they say, oh, you know, my nephew's 8, he can handle it. I'm like, but I know, because like most 8-year-olds can't handle it. So I think like maybe the families and the communities of hobbyist gamers are not representative of what the average person can do. And so I think if we interact more and play test more with mainstream, quote unquote, mainstream people, then we would get a better sense of what the average kid or family is able or interested in doing. And the reason I say that is because I don't want to turn away any family. Like, let's say you grab Wingspan and it's not adequate for your family, then you're like, okay, I hate board games. I'm not going to try anymore. This is awful. So I don't want that to be a barrier towards more families finding games that they enjoy and can learn from. I'm not sure how much time. I have a little bit more time, I think. So this is something interesting I just found. So sometimes the actual BGG community, so there's the official age recommendation in Board Game Geek from the publisher, and then there's one that the community recommends after playing it. And if you'll notice in red, these are ones that actually trended the opposite way. So let's say like Lost Ruins of Arnak, the official age recommendation is 12. Amazon says 18, and the community thought younger kids could handle it like 10. So it's just really interesting how like I was surprised that any of them skew the opposite way. You do have some trending the right way, like Pandemic. The community thought maybe ages 10 were more appropriate, and Amazon says 13. But yeah, I just thought it was interesting. Sometimes we can be way off base with what we think that children and families can do. So, and these are ones that trended in the same direction. So it's not all bad. Like, we do have a general sense. It's just that sometimes we can be completely off base. So just to summarize, like, why do I care? What do I take from this? Is that so hobbyists and mainstream audiences share few top 100 family board games, and top hobbyist rankings lack the classic games that have appealed to mainstream audiences for decades, i.e. chess, Risk, Clue, things like that. In 1 out of 5 board games in the Board Game Geek Top 100 family ranking, publishers assign lower player age recommendations than Amazon. And in many instances, the community disagrees with Amazon on age recommendation. So what does this mean? So rankings, so as in Jan's talk, we were talking about awards. People look to awards, especially designers, to like, what should I be making? What does the industry think is good? And it seems to be like when we look to Board Game Geek, they favor these heavyweight, really complex games, and then everyone thinks they have to like take a really simple, elegant game and add more and more and more and more into it. And that's not the case. I think the industry needs to respect classic games with simpler yet elegant, clever mechanics. And then the designers will see that and then in turn create more simple, elegant games that can appeal to mass market more than they do right now. Empathy. So industry needs to better understand complexity in relation to player age, like knowing the audience that is out there that is ready for us to, they want to play board games. Board games are fun. Everyone agrees. It's just that we want to introduce people to our amazing hobby. And the way we do that is by like having empathy on what they want and what they're able to handle. And so in turn, if we make changes with publishers, designers, and the community, we could have movement toward more accessible board games for mainstream audiences. And so this is where I see like publishers first taking a chance on lightweight games with elegant, clever, simple mechanics. And then in turn, designers will see that, and then they will create more lightweight games that retain modern game mechanics. And then the community as a whole, once these are more prevalent, will accept them and consider more lightweight games for awards, rankings, etc. So I don't know how much time I have, but that's basically what I wanted to tell you today. I'm working on more things like what types of mechanics are in the top 100, types of themes, and comparing that over time. But I'm a huge proponent of making more accessible board games for the public. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Our last presenter on this panel is Brandon Blackburn. He's going to be talking to us about haunting in dwelling. And before you get started, I just wanted to say, yeah, keep the questions coming in the Q&A section. So that's after Brandon presents, and we'll be going through some of those so that the panelists can share some of their answers with a larger group. So with that said, Brandon, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Great. Thank you.
Awesome. Wonderful. Let me share my screen and we'll get started. And that is not what I wanted to do. All right. Hello, I'm Brandon Blackburn, a doctoral student from UCI, and I'm really excited to talk to you about this game, Dwelling, a solo game for Ghost. In this game, a player navigates a home that was once familiar as an embodied spectator, seeking to recuperate fading memories by leaving impermanent marks, alternatively on the game itself and on their body. In this talk, I'll present a small part of an ongoing project about atmospheric narrative, which is still very much in the workshop stage right now. So we'll take a crack at it, see where we get, and leave plenty of room for feedback in the Q&A afterwards. And that is not. As a warning, this talk will be distressing in a way a lot of things aren't. I'll be talking about trauma, precarity, self-harm, death, climate change anxiety, and some other things. So if you need to take a moment for yourself to mute me, please do so. With that, here we go. The solo journaling game Dwelling articulates a queer negative potentiality by troubling the idea that meaningful play is additive. In being a game that is as much about forgetting as it is about remembering, the game creates a critical play space in which memory itself operates as a mechanic for creating ephemeral affective moments. In these moments, something past manifests in the present as a mark on the player's page, their body, or their mind. But the game is also about turning the page, about watching marks on one's body fade over time, and about forgetting the specifics of a moment of inscription. I read this duality as an erotic exchange between the inside of a porous subject and the environment in which that subject sits. By erotics, I take a definition that is wholly rooted in play, play between inside and outside, surface and depth, and self and other. This complication is important because of what is often read as a point of impasse in queer theory between Lee Edelman's No Future and Jose Esteban Munoz's Cruising Utopia. Edelman argues that discourses of futurity operate by deferring culpability and responsibility for action perpetually forward onto a subject we call the child, which can hold all of our hopes and anxieties but cannot speak for itself. Munoz, however, reads potential in what Edelman calls futurity, arguing that we can strive toward a queer horizon, which always both exceeds and eludes us. What I call queer play intercedes to trouble the institutional subject positions implied by normative play. Within this malleable and ever-changing space of the game, queerness enacts itself as atmosphere. It is a haunting hyperpresence that complicates both the radical denial of futurity in No Future and the potential of the perpetual horizon in Cruising Utopia. Using a critical play methodology, I tie my experience playing the game to broader disturbances in queer and environmental critical theory. The game Dwelling specifically produces and enacts these stakes. It shows us that haunting and dwelling are, or at least can be, the same activity because they both comprise a process of holding on to something despite a mounting compulsion from within or without to let it go. The difference is in perspective, not necessarily in action. After all, to dwell means to live, like dwelling, but it also means to linger, like don't dwell on it. The title Dwelling, therefore, implies to be both in a place at a time, but also to be in a place past a time. The best tool I've found for talking about this variable perspective is in environmental humanities' decentering of humans within the atmosphere. Think of holding your breath. If you're doing it out in breathable air, you're threatening your life. But if you're doing it underwater, you're actually preserving your life. As Jean-Thomas Tremblay argues in Breathing Aesthetics, breathing is inevitably morbid. As long as we breathe, And as long as we're porous, we cannot fully shield ourselves from airborne toxins and toxicants, as well as other ambient threats. With this hermeneutic of breath in mind, I will focus on 3 key mechanics in dwelling, which are marking, lingering, and forgetting, which map neatly onto 3 in-game actions a player can take: summon or conjecture, remember or recall, and mark or be marked. In marking, I'll talk about the process of playing the game for the first time and how dwelling inscribed itself on me both literally and conceptually. In lingering, I will talk about what has persisted from that first playthrough and how my relationship to the game has changed over time. Finally, in forgetting, I move beyond the game to address 2 questions. What does it mean to forget or be forgotten? And what does it mean for a mark to linger in a place after context is no longer legible? Breathe in. From the text. There is a sinking feeling in my gut, in this place that's now mine, again through loss. Still, months have passed and paperwork was signed, and I'm in an old house that is new to me. I haven't gotten used to its sounds, its shapes, the feel of it just yet. So I wake up some nights to sounds or to a weird feeling, something unfamiliar enough that it stirs me out of my dreams. Dwelling was not a fun game to play, nor is it a game I think you can win in the sense gaming communities tend to use the term, which involves dominating something. Instead, it is a game that plays around with the very concept of stakes and win states. While colloquial usage of play can bring to mind the frivolous or leisure activities of childhood, critical play scholarship is much more about troubling, unstable, ephemeral spaces than it is about just having fun. As Bo Ruberg argues in the chapter No Fun from Video Games Have Always Been Queer, queer play can allow us to explore alternative ways of feeling, desiring, and being, and to participate in a counter-hegemonic force that disrupts dominant and implicitly heteronormative presumptions about the affective purposes of video games, and I would argue games more broadly. While I happen to like this chapter quite a lot, I do contest that play studies has to focus on what we get out of play and argue that it might also be about what we lose during play. In other words, while I did happen to have fun of a kind while playing Dwelling, fun wasn't the point. My fun wasn't repeatable. It didn't produce capturable data in the way large gaming corporations might want it to. It didn't hold my attention, nor did it keep me buying, nor did it make me want to come back for more. It took things from me and left me feeling small and vacuous. To illustrate, I'll share a brief anecdote. When the game tells me to make a mark on my skin, I do it lightly with a fingertip. As I do so, my finger runs over the small raised marks on my skin from when I opened my arm with a razor blade in my teenage years, now a subtle array of parallel lines running up my forearm. I can remember the pain and the pleasure of making these marks, but I can no longer recall the exact moment of inscription the way I could a decade ago. As my finger glides up my arm, 2 of the marks crisscross for just a moment, one fading almost as soon as it is made, the other lingering long past its initial moment of inscription, past my memory of it, past likely my entire life. Playing Dwelling was painful. It made me think of the fragility of my existence and of the enormity of the world and of the smallness of my place in it. It made my body feel unstable, permeable, malleable, diffusive. It made me want to hold on to things, to batten down the hatches and keep myself safe against the world outside, which leads me to my second key mechanic in the game, lingering. Hold your breath. From the text. Feeling desperate at how empty the room feels, I instead want to fill it with a memory. I take a moment to remember the last time I saw him as I remember him, experienced him warm and familiar, as much him as he could ever be, not knowing in the moment this would be my last memory of him, with him. It's nice to have those memories now, remembering him as he always was, the best parts of him, the things that made him lovable. As unreachable as they all feel now, it's nice to have the memories, just as it's nice to have the mementos. While I was doing research for this talk, a professor of mine, John Pitt, a Japanese literature and media scholar focusing on environmental humanities, talked to me about this idea of the house, which can provide some protection, but cannot fully insulate us inhabitants from the atmosphere. Here, the house itself operates as a kind of body, which the atmosphere can permeate. As I give this presentation, I am in the middle of a move, following a long period of time living in what was frankly a pretty awful student apartment complex, with mold in the walls and frequent unannounced visits from staff. Living in my old place drew my attention to the inherent tension in both occupying a dwelling in which you can enter and leave, and in trying to dictate what else is allowed to enter or leave that space. Thinking of dwelling, I also think of how difficult it is for me to take up or maintain space, because of how precarious my various compounded minoritized identities make me. The effect is that I feel frequently that I have overstayed in a place before I have even arrived. So in a sense, I feel like I always haunt every dwelling I inhabit. This game reminded me that what I am often desperate for is not a place, but a fugitive feeling of belonging. I chase the flukes in those same systems that oppress me so that I might feel like anything at all that I hold dear to me might last. I can explain a little bit of what I mean by talking about the term homeless. Well, I'll say up front that I understand and respect many of the social political motivations of the shift from homeless to unhoused. I do want to argue that there is something lost in this shift, which is the focus on the detrimental psychological damage being without a place one can call home does to a person. The reduction of this issue to a building with 4 walls and a roof distracts from the trauma of feeling permanently out of place, like you don't belong, and of being forced to wander through a world that systematically refuses even to see you. It is always holding your breath while waiting for the wind to be knocked out of you. And it is this feeling of debilitating alienation that dwelling lives in producing, maintaining, and reenacting for its player, in drawing attention to the fragility of the places we call home. How do we hold on to things that are always decaying around our heirs? This question brings me to my final key mechanic in dwelling. Breathe out. From the artist's statement. Greetings to the I we both are in this story. I hope it wasn't an uncomfortable shift, the I that is you becoming the I that is me. We can both haunt these pages as there's plenty of room for the two of us, and even the additional yous that may return to it from time to time. We speak often of the restless or vengeful ghost, but we do not often consider the specter who simply remains in a place, or the spectator who watches events but cannot meaningfully affect them. Environmental humanities is littered with analyses of objects that linger past their time, resisting containment or removal. Analyses tend to focus on things that do not belong, the irradiated area following a nuclear power plant meltdown, or plastic in the Pacific Ocean. Rarely, however, do we apply this lens to things that live, to the endangered species or the family in the flood zone that resists relocation. And seeking to decenter humans as the referential point in environmental studies, how might we use the embodied spectator in dwelling to unlock potential analyses of actors, both human and non-human, seeking to persist in a volatile and hostile environment? What is contained in the idea of a ghost that is non-malicious, that does not aim to frighten, but simply to stay in a place that is already in the process of disappearing? The danger of some sections of environmental humanities is to broaden statements to the point that we cannot see the differences in situations. While it is true that climate change affects everyone, that does not mean that it affects everyone in the same way or at the same intensity. However, I think that dwelling in being a solo journaling game is compelling precisely because it is invested in puzzling out this nuance. By blurring the boundaries between what it means to haunt a place and to live in one, it complicates cultural understandings of persistence and belonging, and allows its players to parse the ways in which one's unique combinations of precarious circumstances coalesces into this thing we call home. So by way of conclusion, I will leave you with one final conjecture based upon the ending mechanic of dwelling, which allows the player to start over again if they are not yet ready to move on. I propose that we think of journals not as tools for remembering, but as technologies that remember for us, so that we might allow ourselves to forget. We don't write things down in a diary, say, or on a shopping list so that we remember. We do so that forgetting does not hinder the direction we want our lives to go. I argue that one way we might tease out some of these differences in our situations is by looking at how forgetting operates in our lives. What kinds of things are forgotten and how quickly do they fade away? Echoing Tremblay's words about breathing, a dwelling is just as much a place to die as it is a place to live. It is just as much a place to fade away as it is to linger. If you've ever come home from a long day of work and taken a sigh, you will know that a home is a place in which we permit ourselves to expel the breath we must hold to preserve ourselves in the outside world, just as it is a place where we refresh our breaths to venture outside again. Similarly, a journal is a place where you teach yourself to forget, and of course, a place to which you can return if all of a sudden you find yourself needing to remember. I'm happy to continue this conversation elsewhere, so please feel free to reach out, and I'm of course happy to provide any sources for this talk by request. Thank you very much.
Wow. Okay. So thank you so much to our 4 panelists. We are going to transition to questions and answers now. And so I see that some of our panelists have been generously responding in the Q&A textually, but I want to highlight some of these so that the larger group can maybe get some of these answers, or if you've thought of something in the meantime that you want to add to your answers. And so while we're doing this, if people want to load up additional questions using the Q&A function, they are welcome to do so. So we'll start with a question for Jan. So Danielle asks, could you elaborate more on the different rubrics or standards that the various awards use or don't use to determine their selections?
Yes, thank you for the question. Yeah, I've briefly replied in the Q&A, but there seems to be a lot of different approaches to this. Some of these awards, like the Ennies and the Origins Awards, require submissions by the publishers. So it's sort of this process that people have to kind of apply for being considered for the award, whereas the American Tabletop Awards and the Spiel des Jahres is more sort of trusts the committee members and jurors to kind of make the selections but on their own. So there are different approaches, also different criteria, like especially the national awards often require that the game is published in or localized into the national language, which also kind of sometimes affects which games can be considered and whether they are awarded in that given year or later when they are released in that. So I think there's a lot of different approaches, and of course, it's also not always very transparent what goes into these processes. I think Spiel des Jahres is maybe the more kind of forthright or with what's their process and how they understand their responsibility. But yeah, I think there are a lot of small differences, and might be hard also for the people kind of looking at these awards lists to kind of then understand what's really kind of behind the selection process and why some games are not selected, especially with these awards that require submissions by publishers.
Thank you. And yeah, so I'm going to maybe end up re-asking some questions that folks answered in the text, mostly for our recording and people who might watch on YouTube later who can't see the Q&A. So thank you for doubling up. I appreciate that. So the next question, it was posed to Jan, but I think Catherine might also have something to say to it. So the question is, do you feel that the slightly more casual game buyers invest too much trust in the awards as a method of ensuring that they're not buying a dud? Or do you think that this is a valuable service that they provide? And this is a question from Joe.
I guess I can quickly start. I think especially Spiel des Jahres, I think it really accepts this kind of responsibility and focuses on these kind of audiences that might not be as well versed in the hobby. So they are targeting this specific demographic, and I think then it makes sort of sense for audience members to kind of take that into account. And given the number of games published, it makes sense to kind of filter some of these games, but it's of course comes with a lot of problems. Kind of what are the agendas of these committees, whether they're serving more the industry or kind of the audiences. And I think with Spiel des Jahres, there have been sometimes discussions that some games are rewarded or awarded based on kind of the prior kind of pedigree of the designers, sort of like maybe some of their previous games were better, but now we're kind of paying our dues and recognizing this designer. So this is something that the casual players or people new to the hobby might not understand, like these politics that are going behind the scenes. So I think it's also important to acknowledge that these prices might be very kind of selective and focus on these established names even in, in the case of Spiel des Jahres.
And also, I think that's true. But I also think it's dependent on like where the audience is buying from. So like, let's say you go to Walmart or Target, maybe you're not so concerned about the sticker on the box about the award, depending on who you are. But if you go to like Barnes and Noble or you buy from Amazon, like you might be like, oh, this has lots of awards. This must be a good game. Or if you go to like a board game restaurant or cafe and you're looking around and maybe you're asking advice from the people that work there, like, oh, well, this one has, tons of awards. This is what we should do. And then it's dangerous because if you get that and you don't actually like that game, then you're like, wow, I don't really like this game. I must like board games are not for me. So I feel like it just depends on where you're buying from, but I think it does affect casual gamers as well.
That's so interesting because it makes me think about like the difference between in a Target or a Walmart, like going to the toy section and that's where the games live versus going, like if you're in a bookstore, then maybe it like has a different, just the environment that you're in has you considering different factors. That's super interesting. Thank you. Okay, so the next question from the chat comes from Alexander, who first wanted to say congratulations to everyone and then asks a question for Mikhail. The question is, I'm teaching a design course and I'm looking for ideas involving co-design and game design in a similar way to your project. Have you tried this approach with other themes beyond urban spaces, maybe something closer to social design or cultural preservation?
Yes, I've done some similar stuff, some similar games, mostly for environmental and for heritage preservation, because that's also some of the issues I work with. So this is totally possible. And I believe that this is necessary. For example, I'm doing a game about fishes, river fishes, and there was a lot of problems to match the game with the biologist perspectives, because they want something that was not possible to do in the game. We needed to do a lot of simplifications, and we must do this by co-designing, by testing, and by having all these dimensions in the game design process, because otherwise we'll have something that we usually would see in some games that is pasted on themes that make no sense and lead to ludonarrative dissonance. And I think nobody wants that. And we need to create this from the beginning. And when we are dealing, for example, with stakeholders, imagine environmental issues or something like that, we should create something more ludic and not much about simulation in the start of the process. In my experience, this works because they see as a good investment for time, because they are having a good time in the beginning. And then if in a progressive way, we show them that the transformation of the playful activity that they are having is producing results, we won them and we'll have them to the entire co-design process. And this is something that I've done, and I think it results transforming the playability into goals, because usually they just participate in this process because they want to see goals. They want that the game do something for them that is connected to a project or for something to defend or to make awareness. So this process, I think it's important because we need to win the people, just the stakeholders for the game, for the public for the game, and also to have a kind of tool to create the games from a game design perspective and from a content perspective to be coherent.
Thank you. Okay, so I lost my place in the Q&A. There it is. Okay, so the next question comes from an anonymous attendee, and it's directed to Brandon. So they write, "Hi, Brandon. Thank you for your challenging and intriguing discussion. I am curious how you grapple with the public and personal nature of your research and how you position yourself within that spectrum."
Hey, Anonymous. Thank you so much for your question. So that process of grappling is actually exactly what I'm interested in. So I am thinking about the ways that we differentiate those two categories, and I don't think that we can, not entirely anyway. in terms of personal and private, I think that I'm more interested in the interplay between actually teasing those things out and what factors go into that process. So going back to the idea of the house, you know, there's a play there between sort of the private being in the house and public being outside of it. And the house itself is sort of this malleable, permeable membrane sort of between the two. And it's actually the exchange of things going back and forth across that membrane that defines those two. In terms of sort of positioning myself, that's part of the reason that I'm sharing kind of really personal things and really professional things in this talk, is that I'm trying to focus on sort of where exactly the lines between those kind of lie.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm gonna move over to Catherine again. And so I want to make sure I think I'm understanding this question correctly. So another anonymous attendee posed a question for Catherine, asking about whether perhaps Amazon is marking games that are not that well developed as family games, just in an attempt to try to, you know, like pump them up or turn perhaps a negative into a positive. And if you have any response to that supposition.
Yeah, I think if that's true, which I mean, it might be true for some of the games, they weren't ones in my data because I had the top 100, and these are like really well developed, well reviewed, well like best marketed, and like I manually curate those, and so like these were not games that I would describe as not well developed. But I think that could be true for family games in general. Like maybe they do just lump them somewhere, like, hey, it's a family game. But yeah, I don't think it's for the top 100.
And perhaps we can stick with Catherine again. So Elizabeth asks, hey, Catherine, I have heard people claim that as Board Game Geek has grown, the complexity bias is lessening. Do you see any evidence of that in your studies?
Yeah, so I just anecdotally, I do. And so I'm very hopeful. So I've noticed this, it's been like a big concern of mine and other people for a long time. I think it is getting better. And I don't have hard evidence to tell you that right now because I didn't done like an overall study of the overall complexity of the top overall, the top family and top this, top that. But I do like just going through my most recent batch of data, it did seem like things were getting a little better. And that's something I hope to do in future is look at overall if it's better for like, you know, more classic games and less complex games. And I think she also asked one about Amazon. I think you can see the trends on Amazon more clearly, like Amazon starting to include more and more complex games. So I think they're like slowly melding together, and maybe at some point in the future they'll meet up. We'll see.
What a well for further research. How great for you.
I know,
You get to
right?
keep tracking it. All right. And y'all keep the questions coming in the Q&A or even in the Discord. I'm trying to keep my eyes on both, kind of going back and forth. We have another question in the Q&A, and this comes from Sophie, and it's directed to Brandon. So Sophie asks, can you tell us more about the mechanics of dwelling and the genre of journaling games overall? Is the mechanic of forgetting that you identified in your talk something that you've seen across journaling games?
Yeah, really great question, Sophie. Thank you. So journaling games are kind of this sort of weird kind of niche within often analog games, and they play around with different things. And that's actually a point of impasse in this project, is I'm trying to decide whether it's a project about journaling games that includes environmental humanities elements, or a project about atmosphere that takes the form of focusing on journaling games. So we can talk after. But the other one, like kind of main one that most people tend to think of is a 1,000-Year-Old Vampire, which is like a journaling game. You are an old vampire and you're essentially writing things down and kind of recalling sort of this very long life that you've had. In terms of dwelling, the mechanics are you're sort of given a prompt and then you're asked to remember things. So it's like, here's a picture of a bookshelf. You look at the bookshelf and you remember the books that are on there. What are the books on there? Pick one up. What did it feel like in your hands? What's the book about? And as you're doing that, you're sort of conjuring memories. You're writing in the game itself, kind of permanently altering it, like one panelist yesterday talked about. There was one more part to this question. Yes, and then mechanics of forgetting, I think that's actually inherent to the journaling genre, not just to games, but to journals and diaries kind of inherently. There is this idea that journaling is kind of like this really egotistical thing in a lot of aspects of critical theory, that it's a way of kind of preserving yourself. And I think it's actually the exact opposite, that it's a way that you teach yourself to forget, that you allow yourself to sort of not have to be this congealed, coalesced thing out in the world.
Yeah, and maybe just to kind of further that. So I've also heard this genre of game called a keepsake game, which I think is interesting. Like you were talking at the end about like the journals being like a technology that we use to like keep things. And that made me kind of think, oh, that's really interesting. And I'm wondering if maybe that could be connected to Mikhail's work, where it seemed like some of the projects that you demonstrated were about like making physical things. So did you see folks kind of holding on to those objects as keepsakes, or kind of using them to retell the story of your play?
Yes, totally. In the case of participatory budgeting, that game, that was a very curious effect, because I simulated the budget with a chest with coins, that I would give the coins according to the project progress. And then they use the coins to simulate, well, we are politicians, we are going to rob the money and to turn it to an offshore bank and something like that. And that helped to create a narrative about the activity they were doing. And for example, when the politicians play the game, they said, well, because I'm an honest politician in this game, I'll try to rob this as much as possible. So this make the connections through to the reality and to the fiction that was created in the game, and this helped to make it more fun. But I think that all the participants thought about all that things that were connected to the values, and that this was a way to create something that was not defined in the rules. It was nothing that I incentivized, but they used it as a way to create it, a more engaging thing. So when we create these sandbox games, I think that we have additional potential. And when we play a game like this, even when it's a commercial game, when we give pieces to the players, they start to build something, even though it might not be connected to anything. It can be a very dry Euro game about the simulation of an economy, but they use the sticks and the cubes to build something when they are not doing anything or they are waiting. But we can use this as a game dimension to make it more connected to our purposes and to the narrative that we want to the game. So this is a way of manipulation, also providing some components that will incentivize some kind of behavior.
Thank you so much. And jumping over to the Discord, so Danielle posted there a link to an archive of journaling games on itch.io, and I clicked it, and first off, I love browsing itch.io. It's so exciting. So there's tons of options there. And one of them is about creating a journal using all of your unused leftover stickers. And so like the 90s Lisa Frank little girl in me just got extremely excited about that one. But so y'all can check out that archive as well. So as I kind of look through the Discord to see if there's any other questions that I missed there, I also want to invite the panelists, if they have any questions for each other, feel free to ask. And I'm just going to scroll for a moment in Discord.
Can I ask something to Jan?
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. I found your communication very interesting because it reminds me something that I do. I'm a YouTuber, a content creator, and a game reviewer in Portuguese. So I do a lot of things in Portuguese language for my platforms. And I'm part of the jury of the Game of the Year, Jogo do Ano in Portuguese, by Spiel Portugal. And this is very strange when we do this because we do this as voluntaries. And sometimes it's difficult just to get the games to evaluate them in the quantity that all the participants in the jury have them. And some publishers immediately give you the game. So they are not paying us, but they are giving the game so we can make a review. But some of them do not find this that has value for itself, neither for the content creation, neither for the prizes in the jury. So this is something very strange that I wanted to share my personal experience, and I was surprised when I started to do this, because if you consider the real cost of a game, it's usually 1/5 of the actual value that they sell in the shop. We should think about this.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your experience. It's really interesting, and I know that a lot of these, when the nominees are announced and awards, grades is really important, I think, opportunity for content creators. And I've seen a lot of videos kind of commenting on nominees, so it seems like it's, there's definitely this interest that is creates this event that people can talk about. But then it's also interesting to see that for some publishers it might not be as kind of valuable. So thanks for sharing it, and we'll be really interested in talking about it more with you towards.
Any other questions from panelist to panelist?
Can I make another? Sorry to
Sure.
monopolize this, but it's for Catherine. And I'm sharing something about my relations with my children. My oldest children, she's almost going to make 10 years old, and I play heavy games, like you can see by the games in the back of my back. And sometimes she wants to play the games that I play, just to be part of my experience and to be together with me. And she's very proud to play complex games. So I think this can be a way to engage children and families when they can participate in the same type of activity, especially the type of activity that the parents value. So a way to connect and transform a game that it's not a familiar game, but in a family activity. So I think this is different from a gamer's perspective. And I also collaborate with some publishers in Portugal, and sometimes they say to me that they get complaints from customers and the customers say, I bought this game and now I need to learn it. This is a common complaint. So they are not expected to learn the game. So
Yeah.
it was my sharing.
No, I think that's really true. And I think that kids can definitely play complex games with their parents, and that's wonderful. I think it's more like the degree of scaffolding they need to play the game. And I think the age recommendation is more like, ideally, if you could give this to kids ages 10 and up, they could play no problem. They don't need anyone's help. But it's funny you mentioned that about the learning the game. This generation's, I'm a teacher, so I use games as often as I can in the classroom. If they have to spend more than a minute looking at the rules, they're done. They don't want to learn. And so I even with simpler games, I have to as a class do 1, 2, 3, and because they will not read and learn the game. That's the most frustrating part. So it's funny you mentioned that.
All right. Well, I wonder if we still have a good 15 minutes. So if other folks have other questions to share in the Q&A, we can do that. I feel like a lot of discussion is also happening in the Discord right now, where people are sharing some games to play with each other and discussing Board Game Geek. Oh, that actually does remind me. I do, maybe this can be some concluding question before we take a little stretch and coffee break. So I had a question for Jan, and maybe also Catherine could speak to this a little bit. So when it comes to these awards, I'm wondering if you might speak a little bit about how game awards or games rankings or games kind of archiving and cataloging, like happens on Board Game Geek, how those things kind of dovetail with, you know, groups like ours that are trying to put academic attention on games. How do these things serve as useful tools or as like sorting mechanisms to direct academic attention? Do you think that it, you know, is helpful and useful to concentrate conversations, or do you think it might mean we are, you know, putting blinders on and only seeing certain parts of the field? And actually, now that I say that out loud, maybe this is a question for all four panelists to weigh on it. If any of you guys have thoughts about that question, how does this relate to what we're doing? Are we repeating some of the same biases, perhaps, as academics with, that you guys identified in your talks?
Yeah, maybe I can start answering. I think there's been a lot of discussion recently also at DIGRA about like the canon and its place and whether there's a video game canon or, you know, analog game canon to speak of. And I think there have been interesting meta analyses, kind of looking at, you know, whether scholars are looking at, you know, certain games, but maybe overlooking, you know, popular games. And there's been a lot of discussion about there should be more scholarship on Roblox and other things. And I think that this is where these lists and these awards lists can be helpful, kind of showing us that, you know, we're maybe not paying enough attention to some games that are, you know, for some reason kind of being, you know, celebrated or praised, and maybe they also are selling well. So I think this can kind of help in this respect. And I also feel like, and something that I've mentioned in the talk, these lists are sometimes very helpful in, you know, just in academic writing, because justifying our own selections in research can be very kind of difficult in peer review, like why we selected these games, and these lists can kind of sometimes provide this sort of additional backing. And I guess this kind of, we shouldn't like completely offload the responsibility of making lists and kind of samples to these awards, but I think this, like from a practical standpoint, this can be sort of useful if we then kind of find a list that kind of serves and kind of fulfills sort of the needs that we have to want to address in that research project. So I think it's a very, you know, complex question. So I leave it to the others to kind of also talk about their opinions.
So just to clarify the question, do you mean like how we are biased in using these lists?
Well, I mean, I guess it's just more of a provocation. Like I'm interested in, like, do you think that we as academics, like, are these useful tools for us, or like, I mean, I guess now that I say it out loud, I'm thinking like every tool is both useful and a constraint, right? So maybe that's kind of how these things work. But like, you know, I'm interested in how these types of tools might both, you know, at first direct academic attention, like, hey, these things are real cultural texts that are worthy of study. Like, you know, we're a real field, like that kind of conversation. But then also maybe, you know, perhaps over time, then it becomes, well, you know, what kind of texts are we not even thinking to look at if we are, you know, kind of focused on these particular archival places as, you know, the place where the conversation is happening.
Yeah, I do think they are helpful. I just wish there was more variety of lists, not just like Board Game Geek, and that's like the one everyone goes to. And there are like different awards, but they, like Jan was saying, like they also have their own problems with each of them. I just wish there was more variety and choice in which list we could use.
Yeah, that resonates with me because I feel like right now when I talk to, friends who aren't, crazy collectors like me, and I mentioned board games, like they kind of think that that's like an all-encompassing category, like, oh, board games, I know what that is. And having to explain to them like, well, there's these different genres and there's these different, like, they're not all just Cards Against Humanity and Monopoly. Like there's other things that are going on and other reasons why you might choose to play. And yeah, kind of having everything be, like the spot where, oh, Board Game Geek is like where board games are, but it's definitely, quite different compared to the archival list of journaling games from Itch that someone posted in the Discord. And what does it mean to think about that as your archive that you start from instead of Board Game Geek? Interesting. Okay, going back. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Can I add something to this?
Absolutely.
Because for some of my research, I was looking, for example, for games that had some specific mechanics to simulate urban planning, and I got to city planning, terrain planning, or terrain transformation. There's several types of games that are classified like this in Board Game Geek, and I try to analyze the most that I can, and I think I analyzed more than 1,000 games on each type. And I started to see there's a lot of entries in Board Game Geek, even mass market games and very old games, if we run the list to the bottom. And when I compare the ranking system of the games that are more popular, it's where we see the most innovation. Most of the games that have lower ranks try to be very similar things between them. So I think the ranking system has its problems, has its biases, but when we try to find design innovations and new ways to do things in different ways to do use a mechanical system to simulate something, the tops are really good to find these differences when we consider them in a broad way, not just the top 10, but for example, the top 300, they give you a lot of variations in each specific type of game. So they are a limitation, but they are very useful if you have the time to analyze at least the most significant type of games in each typology.
All right. Let's see. I think we have time for one more question. So I'm looking back in the Q&A box and I see one from Arnaldo, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. So Arnaldo talks about remembering seeing a German video with kids playing games at a complexity level that our kids, and I'm not sure if that's like referencing like, looks like Brazil is maybe where Arnaldo's from. So German kids playing games at a complexity level that kids in Brazil might have a hard time like kind of keeping consistent. And Arnaldo writes, my theory is that while you live in a home or a society where this is culturally easier because you're raised learning not just about like the game, like the rules of the game, but the before play, like kind of etiquette. So things like stay seated, pay attention, ask questions, stay connected to the specific activity while you're learning the game. And Arnaldo asked if Dr. Sousa could speak to that, but also if anyone else in the panel wants to speak to that question about like the sort of cultural expectations around gaming that, one culture might prepare you for better, as opposed to just like, oh yeah, we all know this game in this country, and so this game is easy for us.
So I think it's for me.
Mm-hmm.
Olá, Arnaldo. Arnaldo is a Brazilian. I know him, and he was one of the speakers of a previous panel. I think this is something very common. It was like Catherine was saying, it's about have any experience with the game. This is why my children, my daughter play Dominion with the age of 7. I will not recommend to give Dominion to a child that has no experience with games. It's about heuristics. They train this type of things by playing multiple times, and they then are able to plan complexer games. But I think it's all about motivation. If you live in a family that plays games and games are there and your parents teach you the games and they are everywhere and you've played many different things, we have the heuristics and the right environment to play even more complicated stuff if we wish. So I think it's about the heuristics, about the being exposure to a game environment, and to be, it's not, they are not different from our children, I believe, in Germany, but they are exposed in a different way than most of our children are. It's my theory.
I also wanted to comment because in my high school classroom, most people are not gamers. Like, they're not, like, a lot of things we take for granted, like having a discard pile, is something a lot of these kids don't like. What is the discard pile? And like, that's really jarring. But like, most of my kids are not familiar with all of the things that we take for granted. So once they play, they can understand it easily. It's just that, like, it's really frustrating if you're expected to play a game without knowing what all of these terms mean. And so I feel like that's the bridge we have to cross, is that because I want my kids in the classroom to play all these amazingly cool games that we have, and they can learn so much from them. But I'm finding it difficult to like have these games accessible to them. And so that's kind of my mission, is that we need to understand that not everyone is familiar with the gaming culture like we are.
Can I add to this something else? I usually run game design workshops for adults, for them to use them in projects, do simple gamification and simple serious games, usually group dynamics and stuff like that. And I try to I had a framework to teach game mechanisms as fast as I can in the least amount of time. And even though I'm, imagine, 10 hours speaking about game mechanisms in different games and stuff like that, the first thing they do when they start to build the game, they do roll and move games and quizzes. So I think we need to invest really a lot more in ludic culture before you ask them to do something different. And this is my experience also. It's something I want to share. Even when we are speaking with adults, it depends on the population. If they are not exposed to this game culture, it will be difficult for them to understand it.
You're muted. Megan, you're muted.
I was on a roll too, shoot. Thank you. Well, I was just thanking the panelists and saying that brings us to time, and saying your presentations and the discussion were amazing. And also I wanted to direct folks. So panel number 6 starts in about a half an hour. The topic is textures of play. And so I hope that everyone gets a chance to get up and stretch your legs and get a drink of water, and then come back here for that. Thank you all again for your amazing presentations, and please continue the discussion in Discord. We're in the panel number 5 discussion, and the links and the chat has been amazing. So thank you again, and I'll see everybody soon for panel number 6. Thanks, y'all.